Cool, so I'm Steve Blow, Senior Solution Engineer at Zerto. I've been there over 2 years now. So yeah, who's actually heard of Zerto, knows about what we do prior to this session? Cool, quite a few of you then, that's good. So Zerto was formed as a company in 2009. The owners of Zerto actually developed a product called Casher, which was sold to EMC and ultimately wrapped up into RecoverPoint. They then obviously went on, formed Zerto in 2009. First product release was 2011. So we've been developing on that since 2011, the last 7 years. To where we are today, I guess there's some key differences around what we were then to what we are now. When we entered the market in 2011, we were very much focused on disaster recovery, and that was the core of Zerto. What we're doing now is expanding that out and very much becoming an IT resilience platform, and that includes mobility as well. And I'll talk to you about ultimately how we're doing that. But the idea is it's a one-stop shop that can provide you multiple solutions rather than having a multi-point solution for your challenges effectively. So we've got over 6,000 customers globally. We're operating in over 70 countries. We've got over 350 cloud providers. I know Computer World work with the likes of Ireland, who are one of our cloud service providers. We've got over 1,100 partners globally as well. So Zerto on a scale is very much growing beyond what would be termed as a startup now. We've got over 700 staff globally, so fairly large now. And I guess really from a Zerto perspective, the key of everything we do is continuous data protection. Whatever we're doing, however we're helping you, the key to it is that continuous data protection, and ultimately the solutions that we can provide through the back of that. So, you know, this is central. We've then also got our journaling capability, which extends the capability of that CDP functionality. And again, I'll touch on some of the intricacies of how that works, etc. Application consistency grouping. Consistency grouping is something that's been missing in this space for a long time. And that's something, again, central to what we're trying to achieve here. And then the long-term retention. This is something that we're working on. It's going to be an ever changing story, but that's really the last piece of the puzzle from the Zerto perspective as well. And what we do around that is actually then wrap the orchestration around it. So typically when you've had disaster recovery, say, and you wanted to orchestrate that piece, you would have something providing you that replication or that capability to recover. But actually on top of that, to orchestrate it, you would need a separate point solution. Zerto is a single pane of glass in that's built into the product. There's no additional cost for that. And that's ultimately an enabler for all of the things we do around multi-cloud and hybrid cloud strategies and things like that. And then lastly, and this is something again that we're developing more as we move forward, is the analytics and control. Everyone's now, or most vendors these days, have some form of analytical platform that gives you visibility of what's going on in your environment, perhaps even beyond the platform that they're providing you. So whether that's storage or whatever that might be. Zerto is also doing this, and it's just giving you additional visibility. You know, everything we're doing, because it's continuous data protection, is down in the seconds, and therefore we have credible insight around networks, your disk I/O and things like that that can be invaluable to you beyond you know, just our product. So sizing, for example, and things like that. So we look at Zerto from an architecture perspective. Zerto really consists of two components in most deployments. So the first of that is the Zerto Virtual Manager, or ZVM, just installs on a Windows VM, and this is where we integrate with the Hypervisor Manager. So in this instance, VMware, it would be vCenter. In Hyper-V, which we also support, it would be System Center Virtual Machine Manager. That, as I said, is just installed on a Windows VM. It takes about 15 minutes to deploy, so it's not very long. Once you've deployed that, it's then a case of deploying our virtual replication appliances, or VRAs. And these effectively are virtual appliance is pushed out via an OVF file from within the ZVM GUI. So you don't have to pre-deploy these or anything like that. Essentially, these are key to our ability to scale. So you have a VRA, a virtual replication appliance, per hypervisor host, and that's it. There's no agents in your VMs or anything like that. If you add another host, you add another virtual replication appliance, and that's how we scale. Zerto today supports up to 10,000 VMs being protected in a single vCenter environment. If you've got multiple vCenter environments replicating between them, that obviously scales greater. So the scalability is one of the keys, and that's why Zerto is deemed enterprise class. What we're doing here is also ensuring that there's no single point of replication contention. So all the replication is occurring at the VRA levels, but we're not sending that all via the ZVM or anything like that. These VRAs are communicating directly with VRAs on the other site of your choosing and replicating it over. We're compressing the data before we replicate it, so we're minimizing your bandwidth overheads. And you can even have throttling built in as well, so that you can limit the bandwidth utilization, which can be useful for that initial sync period. What we're doing is then, as a VM that you've chosen to protect makes a change to the storage, storage will ultimately acknowledge that back to the VM via the hypervisor. When that acknowledgement comes back through the hypervisor, Zerto sees it, takes a copy of the change into memory, and then we replicate it over to the other side. So some key aspects in how that benefits you by us doing it that way. So number one, because we're doing it post-write after the acknowledgement, we're not adding any latency on your communication between your VM and your storage. So there's no storage latency added in, so there's no overhead from that perspective. And because we're taking that data change into memory, we're buffering it in memory, we're not adding any I/O onto your production storage. So one of the key benefits of Zerto is that it has no impact on your production environment beyond the virtual replication appliance itself. And the default deployment size for the VRA is 1 vCPU, 3 gig of RAM. So not much.
How about consistency? Because obviously what you're doing has less overhead than something that, say, what Beam are doing with snapshots. Obviously, using a snapshot means you then get consistency, rather than being crash consistent, it's consistent.
Yep.
So how do you deal with consistency?
I'll touch on that a little bit later on if that's all right. But yeah, it's a good question. Key thing is, this is all Zerto proprietary replication. We're not using snapshots or anything like that that has an additional overhead that needs to be considered on your production environment. What we're doing is every single block that's changed gets replicated over here and stored in a journal on the target side. And that journal will store those changes for the journal history period, or retention period if you will, that you've defined. Today that can be a minimum of 1 hour, maximum of 30 days. So if a change occurs over here, it will sit in this journal here for 30 days. Once it reaches 30 days old, it's promoted to the replica disk. In essence, that replica disk is the oldest point in time in the journal. What we're then doing in the journal is every 5 seconds, I don't know if the battery's going on this, every 5 seconds we're inserting a checkpoint. And that checkpoint isn't a snapshot or anything like that, it's literally a marker in the journal, and that's a point in time that you can recover to. Really, what this is giving you, therefore, the ability to do is to recover to seconds before any issue occurred. So you look at traditional solutions from a disaster recovery perspective, whether it's storage replication, that was typically the go-to historically. With that, you get a great RPO for physical failure, but if you have a logical failure, most situations what's on A is on B and you're going back to a snapshot or a backup. Your RPO then drastically changes. So you don't have that consistency of saying it doesn't matter what the issue is, our RPO is going to be this. You couldn't say that in that scenario. What Zerto allows you to do here is, regardless of whether it's a physical or a logical issue, you can go back to just seconds before that issue occurred. One of our big use cases today is ransomware. So obviously with ransomware, encrypts your files, etc., etc. With Zerto, you can actually roll back to a point in time seconds before your files are encrypted, minimizing that data loss, rather than going back to a backup or a snapshot prior to that, which potentially occurred hours earlier. So it's about minimizing that data loss window. And that's really where the journal comes into its own. If we then think about consistency across your application, when you are looking at your applications today, I'm pretty sure most of them are not going to be just a single VM. There's going to be dependencies on multiple other VMs. And today, how do you protect those? If you're using traditional technologies, you're protecting each VM individually still, even though they're all dependent on each other. So it means when you come to a recovery scenario, you can recover all of your VMs to make up your application. Maybe that doesn't take that long. But once they're all up and running, are they going to be in sync with each other? Is the application going to be usable, or are you going to have to fight to get them all back into sync? And that's really one of the big challenges that has, again, historically existed in the marketplace. And what Zerto allows you to do is, instead of having that per VM protection, we have what we call virtual protection groups, which is a consistency grouping, and it allows you to group all of the VMs that make up your application in a single virtual protection group, or VPG. What that means is when we're then inserting those checkpoints in the journal every 5 seconds, we're actually inserting them at the exact same point in time across all VMs in this virtual protection group. Cool thing is as well, these VMs don't need to be on the same data store underneath. They don't even need to be on the same hosts. As long as they're in the same vCenter environment, we can group them in a virtual protection group and ensure consistency so that when you're recovering them all to an in-synchronized state. So you can recover your VMs knowing that actually my application is likely to be usable because everything's going to be recovered to that exact same point in time.
So that 5-second checkpoint, that's just for consistency there. So you're replicating at a faster rate.
Correct.
But you're just putting that 5-second checkpoint in that's consistent across all the VMs in that application.
Absolutely. 5 seconds is our aim, but we do ensure right order fidelity. And so because of that, that sometimes does drift a little bit, but 5 seconds is our aim. Effectively, if block A changes and then block B changes and it's reliant on block A, and we replicate block B, but we haven't replicated block A, we will wait until A arrives before we insert that checkpoint.
Cool. Thank you.
Is this done with VMware's IO filter or?
No. So it's our own technology underneath this.
Is that the same for Hyper-V as well?
Pardon?
Is that the same for Hyper-V, your own filter?
Correct, yes. So key thing is as well, we still support all of the core features of the hypervisor. You're not limited on what you can utilize. So DRS, HA, vMotion, storage vMotion, you can still utilize all of those. Live migration in Hyper-V, all of those can still be utilized, and Zerto seamlessly continues to protect your VMs. So you're not losing out on any of that functionality either. I'm going to show you a demo later, but I just wanted to take you through this slide and talk a bit about some of the processes. So this is the ZVM interface. Each of these green squares represents a virtual protection group, and it's green because it's meeting the SLA you've configured for it. So the SLA is around journal history and RPO. If we're not meeting one of those, you get an orange alert. If you're not meeting either of them, you're going to get a red alert. So it's a standard RAG chart. Just gives you visibility on that front page. We even give you real-time average RPO on your front page across all of your VPGs. If you go into each individual VPG, you'll get a real-time RPO of that VPG. So this is obviously a healthy state. In the event of a failure, obviously in this scenario, we've lost our primary data center. All the VPGs go red. We're unable to meet the SLA. All you need to do with Zerto is choose the live toggle down here and then select failover. You can then choose which virtual protection groups you want to recover. So again, in this instance, obviously we lost the production site. You're probably going to choose all of them. In a logical failure, you're probably going to want to recover just the application that's impacted or applications. So you've got that granularity there. And then you can choose a point in time. Each VPG can be recovered to a different point in time. So you can choose where you're recovering to. Again, physical failure, you're probably going to go latest. Logical failure, you want to recover to before the logical failure occurred. Whether that's a corruption, ransomware, or whatever it is. And then it's start failover. So it's a 4-click process to recover. Now, with Zerto, when we're protecting your VMs, one of the key things is they don't exist on the target side. You have no visibility of them in the inventory of vCenter or System Center Virtual Machine Manager. So the first step we do as part of the recovery is import those VMs into the inventory of vCenter so that you have visibility of them. The next thing we do is we'll attach those VMs to the relevant networks. We'll re-IP them on a per NIC basis if required. We will obviously run pre and post recovery scripts. all of these settings are actually set when you create the virtual protection group. So when you're creating the protection, which means that when you do come to recover, it is that 4-click process. You don't have to define any of those settings. They're already defined, and then you can fail over. So it's really about minimizing that RTO and the impact that you have to have, and predefining your recovery runbook.
Doesn't that affect the RTO, not having the machines registered on the destination host first? So other solutions would automatically have those placeholder or some VMs there that are ready to go. If you need to mount all of those first, doesn't that add a delay before you compile them on?
Don't get me wrong, there's a time associated with importing those VMs into the inventory, but the pros and cons, Zerto still recovers your VMs in minutes, so it's not going to be a great deal of time. We're talking a few seconds to import in vCenter. And I guess the key thing there is it means that you don't have a mess on your DR side. What's live, what's not, we don't know. Someone's deleted something. None of that, you don't have to worry about that. Zerto manages that all for you. What we also do, just while we're here as well, once you've recovered, you perform that live failover. Your VMs are up and running over here. But what we haven't done in the background is committed the journal to the replica disk. So you're running over here on the point in time you've selected, and Zerto is managing that. But actually what you can do is you can validate, are my applications in the state I want? Have I recovered from the issue I'm trying to recover from? If the answer is yes, you can choose to commit, at which point we then commit the journal to the replica disk from that point in time. And that's a background task. Users can still be using the VMs while that's happening. Alternatively, if you realize actually the issue's still there, you can choose to roll back and perform the failover again to a different point in time. So it's an extra safety net that you've got to validate your recovery before you're stuck. If you're recovering from a backup, the only way to know whether it's a valid backup is to test it, right? And that's a fairly long process. With Zerto, you can recover your VMs in minutes, validate, have I recovered from the point in time I'm trying to recover? Yes, no, commit or roll back, and then perform the process again. You could probably do fair few of those before it reached the same timescales that you're going to get from recovering one backup.
That recovers per VPG, is that right?
Correct, yeah. So you can do them all together if you want. But yeah, the VPG is the granularity today. That being said, in the next release, we're going to give you the ability to recover individual VMs out of the VPG. That's coming in August. So that's one of the major features of the next release. Cool. So that was a live failover, just talked about there. We also give you the ability to do test failovers. Big difference between a test failover and a live failover is there's no impact on production. So production stays up and running, and then we bring up a replica of your production VMs from the point in time, again in the journal that you've chosen to test, on the target side. Key thing is, obviously you don't want a conflict because it is an identical replica. So when you're creating those virtual protection groups, and I mentioned that you can choose the networks and re-IP settings on a per NIC basis for every VM you're protecting, we actually give you separate settings for a test failover to a live failover. So you can use an isolated network or a network that's isolated from production to test your failover before you've actually got to do it. So that's relevant for proving DR without having to have massive outages. Historically, when you're doing DR tests and things like that, you're spending a weekend, a long weekend, all hands on deck for doing the recovery, and it's fairly impacting, particularly on a resource perspective. With Zerto, it's a 4-click process. Anyone could do it, and then you could get your application users to validate, have we recovered, and then roll back.
Am I right in thinking when you're doing your testing, you're still getting the replication going on in the background as well?
Absolutely, yes. So replication continues during that period. There's no at-risk window. We're still creating checkpoints. And actually what we're doing here is we're not altering that checkpoint either. We're actually writing all changes that occur over on this side to what we call a scratch journal. And then when you stop the failover test, that scratch journal is deleted. So everything you test is deleted at the end of it.
Because some other solutions, whilst you're testing them,
yes,
the replication stops. So during that window,
you're at risk. Yes, yeah. Absolutely. With Zerto, that isn't the case. We are still replicating in the background. The other major feature we have, or process we have, is a move. So one of the Zerto's big use cases is around migration and mobility, the ability to move your workloads. So what we do with a move, it's essentially identical to a live failover. We're using all the same settings, with one big difference, and that's that you don't get to choose a point in time in the journal. So the key reason for that is when you're doing a move, it's a control procedure, you don't want any data loss. So when you initiate a move with Zerto, we shut down the VMs on the source side. Once they're shut down, we're inserting a checkpoint post-shutdown in the journal, and then we're recovering to that point in time over here. Obviously, we're creating those checkpoints every 5 seconds, so that whole process takes a matter of seconds, and then we're bringing up your VMs over here, and that whole process is going to take a matter of minutes to move from running here to your entire application running here. If you think about traditional migrations, the biggest challenge that you have in the migration is the data move. And typically the way it's gone is when you're moving the data, at the end of that data move is when your application's running over there. Defining how long that takes is a big challenge. There's a lot of variables in there, particularly around networks, etc. And if you've got applications that are all different sizes or VMs that are all different sizes within the application, different elements are going to end up on this side at different times, and it's very difficult to manage, and ultimately you end up needing a really large migration window. And this is really where Zerto and its continuous data protection differentiates itself, because we'll do that initial sync. You can even bandwidth throttle it during that period. It's a background task. You can make sure it's got the minimal impact on you whilst that's happening. Once the initial sync's completed, we're just continually updating. All of the changes are replicating over here. When you're ready to move, all it is, as I said, shut down the VMs, bring the VMs up here, and you're bringing them all up together. And that whole process takes just minutes. So your migration window goes from this big to just this big. It's an incredibly powerful mobility tool, particularly.
We've used that, haven't we, Ben? I don't know if you want to give just a bit of detail around the situation we found ourselves in with that client.
Again, it's just come down to a minimum amount of downtime that could be tolerated during the cutover.
Yep.
So it originally started, the requirement was for no downtime. And then we asked them about what they're doing with their network, and the network guy said, well, we got an hour to change the networking over, so well, we can use that hour to literally, it was a case of preceding it, and then we just done a controlled failover.
Yep.
Because the lag behind was only sort of like 8 or 9 seconds.
Yep.
It was seamless.
Typically with Zerto, you're going to be running sub 10 seconds behind production.
That's what I was going to ask actually. Can you precede?
Yes, you can precede. So you can precede in VMware and Hyper-V, just a copy of the VHDs or VHDXs or VMDKs over on the target side, and then you select them to precede. We just do a delta sync comparison between the two disks and replicate the changes. And actually, that's the process we use with reverse protection. So everyone always asks, right, we've failed over into the target side, how do we get back? Well, actually, with Zerto, once you failed over here, and then you choose the commit process, we throw up a box. It's got a tick box in there, it says reverse protection. If you tick that, we'll automatically start replicating back the other way. We remember where the disks were on this side, and we'll use them to automatically precede it. So it's just going to be a delta sync in the changes since you failed over, replicated back. We even remember what networks your VM's NICs were attached to, so the VPG is automatically updated. So as soon as that delta sync's completed, you're then in a position where you can actually fail back. And in reality, if you're going back from a live failover, a DR scenario, you're probably going to use a move to go back because it's controlled and you don't want any data loss. So yeah, that whole process is simplified to a tick box, which I think is pretty cool. One of the key things as well that's worth noting is a lot of people ask, well, what happens if the network goes down? How does Zerto react with that? We have a process built in called a Bitmap Sync, which enables us to deal with those issues. Effectively, if this link goes down, or whatever, if we're unable to replicate, maybe there's an issue with the storage and we can't write to the storage. If we're unable to perform that replication, Zerto goes into a Bitmap Sync mode. And what we do in there is on the host themselves, deliberately we do it on the host because it means we can handle VRA failures as well. On the host itself, we have 96 megabytes of RAM reserved for Zerto. So a very small amount of RAM. And what we're doing in there, in the event where we can't replicate, is we're indexing every single block that changes during the period while it's down. Because it's just the block ID that we're indexing, not the actual data, we can actually handle up to 48 terabytes of change per host. If you've got that much change going on and your host has been down that long, you've probably got bigger issues than just the network. But what this means is then when the link comes back up, Zerto will replicate the latest or effectively the block IDs in the order that they were changed. So if that block's changed multiple times, obviously it's only going to be the latest change that gets replicated at the relevant point in time. And we automatically self-heal the replication therefore. So that's a really powerful message around what happens in this scenario. If you look at migrations, for example, if you're doing a big data move and the link goes, you typically got to start again from the beginning. Whereas with Zerto, you've got a little bit more flexibility around that, in that if the CDP is up and running and the link goes, then we're just going to effectively be performing a bitmap sync, and when it comes back up, catches itself back up. You don't get checkpoints, obviously, during that window where it's down, but that's because ultimately the data's not working over here. The key thing is that replication will self-heal itself. You've not got to go in and perform any manual intervention or anything like that. Another capability Zerto has, and this was added a couple of years ago now, but we've recently improved upon it in our last release in February, is actually the ability to recover individual files from any of the VMs that you're protecting. So you can choose any VM that's in a VPG and being protected today. You can then choose any point in time in the journal for that VM. So every 5 seconds you've got the same granularity. And then what we'll do is we'll mount that disk from that point in time on the VRA itself and give you access to it via your web browser. You can choose which files you want to recover. Again, remember, you're able to recover seconds before something got deleted, or seconds before ransomware encrypted your files, or whatever it is. Just the files. And then you can download them locally just in your browser. So today we support Windows. With our latest release, 6.0, which came out in February, we added the support for Linux, ext2, 3 and 4. And LVM is actually coming in our next update, which is due in a month or so. So we're continuously adding to that list. But this can also be an incredibly powerful feature. And this again is when Zerto is sort of crossing that line between backup and traditional DR and resiliency. So another feature that Zerto has built in is the ability to do long-term retention, or offsite backup as we call it. Obviously Zerto today is a 30-day journal. There are plans to extend that in the future so you can get a longer journal. We're also working on developing this feature. So this is in the product today, gives you the ability to take an offsite backup, so a backup of a VPG that's being protected today, offsite and hold for long-term retention, exactly as you would with a backup. You can do that off to AWS or any SMB share today or anything like that. Ultimately, anything that you can present to the ZVM via an SMB share, even if you're using things like TNT drive to present AWS, for example, that's something that you can utilize as a target. And what we're looking to do here is increase the capability of this functionality. So we'll probably be adding incremental in our next release. So the ability to do incremental offsite backups. Today it's a full backup every time, which is obviously fairly space hungry. And this really is where we're sort of completing that picture that we're developing around IT resilience. If you have Zerto and you're protecting your VMs for disaster recovery, why not utilize it as well for backup? There's no impact on your production environment. You've got that overhead that is traditionally associated with backup. You've got your backup window that runs every night and you see all the spikes, etc. You don't get that with Zerto because it's continuous. So there's a lot of pros and cons around that. And as I said, this is something that's going to be focused on in our next few releases as well. So watch out for that. Cool. So we talked a lot about VMware and a bit about Hyper-V, but actually Zerto today also supports AWS and Azure. So this is really where your hybrid cloud strategy can be enabled by Zerto. A lot of people have a hybrid cloud strategy. They say, yes, we've got hybrid cloud, or at least talking about it. And what they'll do is they'll place their workloads where is relevant on day one. So one application in public cloud, another application in their local private cloud. But what they don't think about is actually what happens when those requirements change, which inevitably they do. Having a tool that's able to move workloads around between these environments seamlessly, or as seamlessly as possible, it is really central to having that true hybrid cloud strategy and enabling that. And that's really where Zerto's going with this. You know, we've got the support for AWS and Azure today, and we're probably going to extend on that. From a hypervisor perspective, we've got the support for VMware and Hyper-V. KVM will probably be the next one. Probably won't be until the latter part of next year now, but that'll probably be the next one that we add. And really, this is then giving you that capability to choose where your applications are running as you deem fit. So there's some subtle differences to how we manage this. Obviously, in a VMware or Hyper-V environment, we've got access to the hypervisor. In Azure and AWS, that's not the case. So in those environments, instead of having the ZVM and VRA, we've got what we call a Zerto Cloud Appliance. So in Azure, that's available in the marketplace. In AWS, it's available in the community marketplace. And all that does is then sit on that side and act as a target for your replication. Key thing with both of these solutions is when you're replicating into AWS and Azure, obviously remember Zerto doesn't create any compute elements until failover. In public cloud, that can be really cost effective. So in Azure, you're paying for blob storage only and the compute for the ZCA. In AWS, you're paying for an S3 bucket only and the compute for the ZCA. So it's only when you actually perform a failover that then you have that cost around compute elements. So for applications that typically you maybe don't provide a full DR service to, this is really powerful tool to provide DR at a really low cost point.
Does that provide DR and also migration?
Yes, absolutely. What I would say is migration is a big use case for us, particularly in AWS. We don't have the same integration into AWS today as we do with Azure. With Microsoft, for example, we're very closely linked and work very closely together, and actually we work with them on the APIs that we utilize to make them publicly available. So they weren't available before. So there's a very tight partnership there. But yeah, migration is very key. One of the things we've actually implemented with the last release again in February is the ability to do inter-cloud or multi-cloud. So you can actually replicate between AWS and Azure now. And you can actually in Azure replicate between regions. So you can actually provide DR within Azure itself using Zerto. So again, quite a powerful tool from that perspective. We've also got many cloud service providers who are able to utilize the multi-tenancy capabilities of Zerto. And we're also embedded in IBM Cloud on their VMware offering. So if IBM Cloud is of interest to you from a cloud perspective, Zerto is heavily integrated in there and actually can be automatically deployed, which can be beneficial. Guess the key thing to note in all of this, we've got all of these different platforms we support. Zerto doesn't look any different regardless of which one you're deploying it on. There's obviously some subtleties around when you're configuring VPGs. You know, those settings aren't always going to be the same between all of them. For example, when you're protecting into Azure or AWS, you're able to choose the instance type you're recovering into because you can't match specifications the same as you can in VMware and Hyper-V. But the Zerto interface is exactly the same. Everything is in exactly the same place. The other thing I talked about earlier was analytics. So Zerto has a SaaS-based analytical platform now that you can access. It's optional whether you allow your ZVMs to communicate with it. There's no additional charge for it, but it just gives you that greater visibility of what's going on in your environment, help you with future sizing and so forth. We even have a mobile app on Apple and Android, which allows you to see your VPGs, see what your RPOs are, etc. Don't worry, you can't fail over with it, so you're not going to get your kids putting you in DR accidentally. But yeah, that's really about visibility and just making it a little bit easier for you and your admins ultimately. Now, every time you do a failover with Zerto, whether that's a live test or a move, ultimately we will generate one of these reports. You can then download it from within the ZVM reports section. And what we're detailing here is things like your RTO. In this instance, it was 2 minutes. What we've recovered, so in this instance, only 3 VMs. And then every single step as we took as part of that recovery and the time that it took for each of those steps. Now this is obviously only 3 VMs. You can imagine how long and detailed this report gets when you're talking hundreds or thousands of VMs. The idea being you can export this report after doing the test failover and fire it off to whoever you need to get your regulatory compliance or whatever it is, internal compliance from an audit perspective or whatever the requirements are from that. And no one needs to generate and type up this report or anything like that. It's really a time saver and a quick tick in the box that previously had been quite difficult. So I guess just to mention this, you've probably heard lots about this already today, but GDPR is coming, and Zerto really can help you with a lot of the challenges around that. So it's just wanted to highlight that if there are things you're struggling with around that, potentially Zerto can help you with some of those challenges. This is an American slide, but it is true. Zerto can be installed and replicated in under 2 hours. Potentially you can do a test failover. When we're running POCs with customers, that's all we'll book on a WebEx, 2 hours. And quite often we will have done a test failover as well at the end of that. So it's not complex, and that's really one of the key things we're looking to achieve, simplifying what traditionally has been very complex where we don't believe it needs to be. And also providing you that single pane of glass. There's always been challenges around having multiple solutions and managing them all separately, etc. Having one tool to manage all of them or multiple use cases is a really powerful tool from both a resource saving perspective, but also from a cost. You're only buying one tool rather than multiple. So yeah, let's get into a demo. Is there any questions on any of that before I carry on? Show you. So it's licensed per protected VM. So you only pay for the source VM. There are a few versions of Zerto, depending on how you want to utilize it. The key difference is really around the one-to-many. So Zerto has the capability to replicate your VMs to more than one location. It means you can have a local copy of the journal and a remote copy, for example. So that needs our Enterprise Cloud Edition license if you want that. There's a few other differences where you would need the Enterprise Cloud or ECE as we call it. But otherwise the standard is fine. And we also have a migration-only license, which is a 6-month license, but the full ECE just gives you 6 months to perform a migration, and obviously at a lower cost point. But if you buy the ECE, you can do the migration and then continue protecting.
Buy the migration license and love it so much that you won't want to keep using it. Do you get a discount on the full license?
No. So buy the full one. Yeah, there's some things like that. If you're utilising Zerto through a DRaaS provider or one of our CSPs, then they typically will sell it on an OPEX basis, so you pay monthly. Same with IBM Cloud.
You mentioned VMware Cloud.
So VMware Cloud, as in the one that's on AWS, are you referring to? So today, no, we don't support that, mainly because really there's some complexities around what they're doing and what's ultimately available to end users on that platform.
Is it on the roadmap?
We're looking at it. Really, it's AWS standing up hardware and VMware, putting their stuff on top and allowing you to do whatever they allow you to do, and that's really where the challenges are. So potentially it's of interest to us. I guess we haven't seen a great deal of customers actually utilise it yet, but yeah.
If you want to make use of that monitoring and reporting tool, where would you start? How to get access to it, that sort of thing?
So it's a tick box again, just a tick box in
within this.
within
You just about to show
yes within the ZVM console, so I can show you that. So just in here, and then about, and it's the enable Zerto SaaS features. If you tick that box and it's got the ability to report in, so it's got the access required, obviously over the internet, then you'll start seeing it, and then you can download your mobile app. The key to everything here is My Zerto, the My Zerto portal. Do you have a My Zerto login?
that. I'll need to find out actually.
Okay, so if you don't, and you're a customer, you're entitled to one, so you can get one. There's no additional cost or anything. If you're not registered on the account in our back-end systems, you need to do that, but otherwise you should be able to register regardless. Okay. Then you just download the mobile app and you can get visibility of your VPGs. If you want the full analytics, etc., that's in the My Zerto portal, and there's an analytics tab, and it's all in there. no problem.
So you're using this at the moment, are you? What called
Yeah.
DR or?
Yes, for DR at the moment. So what I didn't know of was, the recording monitoring bit, and yeah, it's definitely of interest at the moment.
Where are you from, sorry?
TLT.
Okay, cool. Cool, so here we are in the Zerto interface. We've got 2 sites, London and Edinburgh. So what I'll do first is I was going to show you a VPG configuration, just show you what options are in there. So rather than create a new one, I'm going to edit one. You get exactly the same wizard whether it's new or edit. There's just some options won't be able to be changed. So obviously when you're creating a VPG, you're giving it a name. Typically, as I said, when you're creating a VPG, you do it on a per application basis. So you've got the consistency around the application and the name fits in with that. You can specify a priority. Zerto by default will ignore this priority. We will get your VPGs to the lowest possible RPO regardless of the priority, unless that's not possible. And that's when the priority comes in. If there's contention or whatever, the ones with the higher priority are going to get the lower RPOs. You're then choosing which VMs you want to protect. So you can choose whichever. You're going to get a list here of all the VMs that aren't currently being protected in the vCenter environment. If you've got the one-to-many capability, the feature set, you can actually choose VMs that are already being protected by selecting this element. Once you've chosen which VMs you want to protect, you can then define the boot order. So this is when we're recovering, we're going to boot the VMs according to this order. So you might want your database servers to boot before your app servers, for example, and things like that. You can come in here and add multiple groups and have boot delays between each group. You can obviously then test the failover to validate, have we got enough time delay in there, etc. You're then choosing where you want to recover to. So you can select your recovery site here. So within Zerto, under the Sites tab, you can pair with as many other ZVMs or ZCAs as you want and have as many sites in there. So when you set up a VPG, you're then choosing where you want to replicate to. It's going to list every one that you've paired with effectively. So you can have VMs going off into different directions. That's not an issue. It's only if you're replicating a VM more than once that you would need the ECE license. You then choosing where you want to replicate it to. So you can choose resource pool, cluster, or host. You can choose the data store you want to recover to. Again, these are the defaults that you're setting for the VPG. So we show you more granularity in a minute. So that's effectively where the data is going to be replicated to on the target side. Journal history you can define here. As I said, maximum 30 days today, minimum 1 hour. You can then even come in and choose to have the journal in a different location. So it doesn't necessarily have to be in the same recovery location as the replica disk will sit. We do recommend it is for performance reasons, but if you have a requirement to do otherwise, it is supported.
Can an individual VM exist in more than one VPG?
Yeah, so that's the one-to-many feature that you need the Enterprise Cloud Edition 1 for. And a VM can be in up to 3 VPGs if you've got that license.
Okay, so even if I'm only replicating to one site, but I want a single VM to be in multiple.
Yes, in that scenario you would still need to do it, but we would only support replicating that VM once to that site. So where we do one-to-many, it's one-to-many sites.
So I was thinking of a use case like a SQL server.
Yeah, shared SQL or something like that.
Yeah, with those 3 different applications, you're going to want to put all those applications in one VPG then, really, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, in that scenario, you could do it that way, or you break the SQL out into its own. Right. You know, we're inserting checkpoint every 5 seconds, even if there is a little bit out of sync, it's only going to be a few seconds. So it really depends on the application and what the impact is from doing that.
Put the SQL in a separate VPG.
Yeah. One of the questions I didn't answer, by the way, was around application consistency that you asked. So if I just go back to that and we'll carry on the demo. So a lot of people obviously ask about application consistency. How do we provide that from rather than a crash consistency? Every single one of Zerto's checkpoints is crash consistent. Yeah. We're obviously inserting one every 5 seconds. As soon as you're doing anything application consistent, you're stunning, pausing, impacting production for a period of time. So you're definitely not going to do it every 5 seconds. You're probably going to do it at most 4 times a day, at most. That then means is when you come to a scenario where you're looking to recover, you could potentially be going back to 6 hours or plus back. What's that data loss worth to you? against a few seconds with Zerto. And then when you tie that into the fact that vast majority of applications these days are ACID compliant, there is really no need.
I suppose if you go back 10 minutes ago and there is a problem because of consistency, you could then go back 12 seconds.
Exactly, exactly that. And we are ensuring right order fidelity, which helps avoid a lot of those problems. So there's a lot of positives from that perspective. So yeah, most customers, less than 1% of our customers actually use our VSS capability. So we do have one. There's an additional charge for it, but in reality, it's old hat, and no one really will use it for recovery. It's a safety net for them. What we are doing in our latest release, our 6.0 update 1, which came out at the beginning of this week, we actually added the capability to insert manual checkpoints via the API. So what that gives you the ability to do is perform an application, hot backup, for example, in Oracle or something like that, at that point in time, insert the checkpoint then, and then stop it and carry on. And you can script all of that through the API if you have that requirement. But as I said, most people are going to want the minimal data loss and go back to the latest Zerto checkpoint that they can get to. And that is really why we don't necessarily see the requirement for that today. So with the journal, you can choose a hard limit for that. So if you set the hard limit for the journal, and we hit that hard limit, we're going to start recycling the checkpoints before we hit the journal history, assuming we haven't hit the journal history that you've asked for. Obviously, you'll be alerted to that, but it's worth noting that capability is in here. And you can have a warning threshold as well, where it's going to alert you when you're getting near to that. Target RPO alert. This doesn't impact anything Zerto does from a replication perspective. It's just an alert. So if our RPO goes beyond whatever you set here, it's going to change the state of it in the ZVM dashboard. So yeah, you can go down to 20 seconds, I think, on this, maybe 10 seconds even. So you can have this down to wherever you need, depending on the application requirements. Test reminder. As I said, if you've got a requirement to do tests on a periodic basis for compliance, etc., you can set what that is here, and you're going to get an alert from Zerto.
Does it then flag it in some way to show you, look, this VPG is out of SLA because you've not done a test?
Yeah, you're going to get an alert just saying a test is due on that VPG, correct. Enable WAN traffic compression. So, as I said, Zerto compresses the data by default when we're replicating. You can disable it if you want, if you've got your own compression techniques. What I will say is if this is enabled, we do compress the journal ourselves on the target side as well. So there's potential savings there, but again, if you're using compression on disk, etc., then maybe you want to use your own hardware tools that you've got in place. So you've obviously configured all of that. That sets the VPG defaults. You would then be able to come in and edit each VM individually if you wanted to. So you can choose a different recovery data store for each VM on a per VM basis, different journal. So the journal exists on a per VM basis, obviously. So you can choose each VM's journal to be in a different location as well. But actually, we give you even more granularity on the next tab. So on the next tab, rather than set the data store location for the entire VM, you're going to see every single disk attached to your VM here, and you're going to be able to edit each one individually. So, for example, you've got a SQL server. You might want the data and log volumes to be on Flash, but the OS on SAS or something like that. You can configure that with Zerto so that's maintained on the recovery side as well. You can choose whether it's thin or thick provisioned. By default, it takes the source site's setting. You can mark a disk as temp data. If you mark a disk as temp data, we will replicate it as part of the initial sync. But from then on, we don't replicate any changes that are occurring. So it's useful for things like tempdb and SQL, Windows page files, Linux swap volumes. Anything that's highly transactional but ultimately recreated on boot, there's no point in replicating. It's just going to create overhead that you don't need. So if you break them out into their own volumes and mark them as temp data, it ensures that A, the disk exists on the recovery, which is quite important. A lot of these will be referencing certain disks, etc. So the disk exists, the folder structure exists, but the changes that are occurring on it, we're not replicating.
It's quite simple, but quite effective. The amount of times in SRM we've not replicated a disk because it's quite transactional, and then you go to a DR failover, you boot it up, and the SQL database doesn't start because the disk doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's just little things like that that extend your RTO essentially. So yeah, you can choose any data store, as I said. You can also pre-seed the volume here. So if you were pre-seeding, you would take a copy of the VMDK or VHDX over to the target side, import it into the data store, choose the data store you want to select the pre-seeded disk from, and then you can browse it here and there and choose a VMDK. We won't let you choose one that's already assigned to a VM or is the wrong size. So there's a lot of validation in there as well. And then lastly, Zerto also supports RDMs in VMware. So if you've got raw device mappings on your source side, we can replicate to raw device mappings on the target side. If you've got a VMDK on your source side, you can replicate to an RDM on your target side. And if you've got an RDM on your source side, you can replicate to a VMDK on your target side. So a lot of people actually use Zerto to perform their storage migrations when they're moving between storage vendors if they're using RDMs.
Just virtual mobile RDMs or physical as well?
Virtual and physical RDMs, as long as they're presented via the hypervisor or VMware in this instance, then we support them.
Using guest agent to help with?
No, it's all done via the hypervisor again. All goes through. As if you present storage directly to the VM, so the hypervisor doesn't see it, then Zerto doesn't see it. So it's worth bearing that in mind. But yeah, you can convert your old RDMs to VMDKs as well, utilizing this. One thing to note is that VMDKs have to be an even number of blocks, VMware rules. So you need to make sure if you are doing that conversion, your RDM needs to be an even number of blocks. But that's really the only challenge there. Once you've set all that up, you can then choose your recovery settings. So this is where you start defining your networks. Again, what we're setting here are the defaults. We provide more granularity later on. So your live failover or move network. So this is going to be a customer or end user accessible network. And then a test failover network, which is typically isolated from production. You can then choose a recovery folder in VMware terms. So if you've got folders specified in your vCenter, you can choose which folders you're recovering your VMs into. Particularly useful from a permissions perspective. And you can actually break that out on a per VM basis as well. I mentioned pre and post recovery scripts. You can define them here. Key thing is they give you a blank canvas to automate whatever you want. You know, changing application connection strings, however, you know, or to whatever level you want to automate that recovery process, you can define it there. And then similar to the storage side of things, you're going to see every single NIC attached to your VMs listed here. So you can then go in and edit each NIC individually and choose different networks for each NIC. Again, you get the separate live failover and test failover options. You get to choose whether you re-IP or not. So you can choose DHCP, static or not. You can even reset the MAC address if you want as part of the recovery process. Be careful with Windows activation and that feature, just because quite often it is tied to the MAC address. So most people won't change it, but if there's a requirement to, you can with Zerto. The backup feature that I talked about, the offsite backup, that would be configured here if you want. So you just need to set up your target repository and then you can choose when that runs and how often. But as I said, this feature is likely to change going forward and we're going to add some additional capability in there, starting from the next release probably. And then that's it. You'll get summary, you click done. If this was the first time I created the VPG, it would go ahead and do the initial sync at that point, or Delta sync if you've chosen to pre-seed. And that's it. You then, once that's up and running, you'll be in a state where it's meeting SLA. You can see this VPG is running at 9-second RPO. And I can actually come over and perform a failover. So if we have a look on my London site, you can see my CentOS VM. On my Edinburgh site, that VM doesn't exist over here. So what I'll do is I'll show you a test failover with the CentOS VM. So choose the VPG you want. Obviously, I'll choose the relevant one. As I said, you can come in here and choose any point in time. So I can just go down and choose any point in time here. Let's choose 152. I think I was in Concord at that time. And then start failover. And what we're going to do here is on the production side, you'll see that there's a task running in VMware. It says protected site. On the target side, you can see we're already making changes. So you can see we've already created that VM. You asked what overhead, wasn't much obviously. And actually this VM I think is now powered on. or will be shortly.
Can you automate that test failover?
Yes, you could. It's all available via the APIs. So we've got an open REST API that you can utilize to automate that if you want. You can even automate a live failover, but there's a bit more challenges on that in what you define as requiring a live failover. So those trigger points, you've got to be pretty certain that's what you want for a failover, and that's why Zerto hasn't effectively built that in, because we're of the belief that failing into DR should be a human decision rather than a computer decision. But yeah, this VM's now coming up. There we go, it's already up. So I've tested a failover, performed a test failover. You can see my production VM is also still up. So that's still up and running. And then if I stop my failover, what we'll do is reverse that process. So you'll see we'll power off. We don't bother shutting it down because everything we do at that point is deleted anyway. And then the VM will be removed. There we go, it's gone. So that's a test failover, nice and easy. If we do a live failover, it's essentially exactly the same, but there's a few different options. So you can choose which VPGs again, which point in time. So we just go with the latest. You can choose whether you shut down the source VM or not. You can even force shutdown if it doesn't have VMware tools on it. The commit policy is the key thing. So I mentioned the capability to validate recovery post failover. If this is set to none, that gives you the ability to do it. You can actually set this to be auto rollback or auto commit and then a time associated with it if you want. But I always think having none gives you complete control there. And then you can choose certain other things like reverse protection. Now that's grayed out in this instance because I've selected none, and that's available, as I said, when you choose the commit process. If I had boot orders and scripts enabled, you would see them there. And then start failover. Yep. So it's just confirming that I need to manually commit that failover once I've failed over. So the first thing we'll see over here is the VM actually shut down on the source side. So it's already initiated that shutdown. And then once that's shut down, we should see then the VM's being created. So you can see this time it's not marked as testing recovery, it's named just CentOS, same as it was on production. Key thing you'll note is the VM still exists on the target side, on the source side, sorry. And what you'll note here is the icon against the CentOS is actually slightly different, which means it's being managed by a third party, in this instance Zerto, whereas on the source side you can see it is plain. And that will remain until we perform a commit and the commit process completes, and then it will return to the normal icon. So this VM is now being powered up. And then once that's completed, I can then go through. In fact, I can choose it now if I wanted to. I could come through. You can see here you've got task waiting for input. You'll have that on both sides, so it doesn't matter which side you initiate it from. So you can select this and effectively choose whether you commit or roll back. So rather than us watching that boot, what I'm going to do is choose to commit, and I'll show you that you get the reverse protection option. If I tick that box and choose commit, what will happen is we'll then start the commit process, and you'll see that in vSphere as well. So you'll see failover commit, and that's where we're obviously promoting the journal to the replica disk. I've only got a 1 hour journal, it won't take very long on here. As soon as that's completed, you'll then see the VPG change to a Delta Sync state. So that promotion's nearly done, and then this will change to a Delta Sync, and you'll see an ETA for that occurring.
Does that switch default to test when you log in? Or?
Yes, it's the default and test. So I switched it to live because of that failover. Yeah. So on this one, it will be on test. because I haven't changed it. Yeah, you don't want that. Oh, I've done a live.
Does it always revert back to test? So if you do one live, you do it, and then you go back to the screens, and then go back.
It stays on live whilst you've got the session open.
Sure.
Next session you open, it will be on test. So you can see this is changing the sync, and in a minute we'll get an ETA on that. So it's automatically remembering where the disks were and then replicating back the other way. It's a bit like a Microsoft ETA where it will say 1 hour 42 minutes, but it will drop drastically. So yeah, that's effectively a test failover. The move is identical to that live failover, but we wouldn't choose the point in time. That's the only difference. You still get the commit process, etc. And we obviously shut down on the source side. That's, I guess, another difference. You've got the option to choose whether you shut down the source side with a live failover. With a move, we don't. What you'll also notice is this VM's disappeared now. As soon as you do reverse protection, that VM's removed from the inventory. Data's all still there, but removed from the inventory. And you'll see that this VM, hopefully, is now back to the normal icon because we've done the commit process. It's worth noting that there is another feature that I haven't discussed as well, which is the offsite clone. So if you do an offsite clone, it actually gives you the ability to recover or clone a VM or VPG to a point in time on a target side, on a data store of your choice. So a lot of people use the test failover to actually do more than just testing DR. They'll use it to do things like test in UAT. So they can test on your live production environment without testing on your live production environment. So most people use Zerto on a daily basis because of that. If they want to do long-term testing, offsite clone is the more appropriate option there, and they can actually clone that off and have a replica from that point in time. Good use case for that is if maybe you've done something in production, has an issue, rather than not resolving it and trying to get to the bottom of what happened, you can actually resolve it, revert, or whatever you need to do. But then you can recover or create an offsite clone or test failover to that point in time and continue the investigation. So that can be another useful use case as well. So yeah, and there we go. Actually, with Delta Sync's already completed because nothing changed on it. So I could then now do restore file, for example. Choose a VM, choose any point in time, choose a disk, and start mount. And then it will mount this. I'm hoping this CentOS doesn't have LVM on it because we don't support that just yet. As I said, that's in U2 in a month or so. But I can now browse this disk from this. Okay, so it is LVM, so I can't actually view this one at this point in time, but the process is essentially the same. So you can then choose files that you want to recover and download them locally in your browser. So LVM is coming, and that's probably one of the most used the Linux file systems that is coming in 6.0 update 2, and we're 6.0 update 1 now. So it will be in a month or so. So yeah, that is Zerto very simply. I mentioned the recovery reports. So in order to recover a recovery report, you can just go in here. You can see this is the one we did just now, the live failover, and I can do export to PDF. It'll download that, and then you can just open it, and you'll see exactly what we did. You can see that this took, the RTO was 46 seconds, which sites we did it between, when we did it, what was recovered, and the steps for each of that. So again, one VM recovered. You can see where we talk about scratch volume that I mentioned, etc., and things like that. So it's all available within there. But yeah, I mean that in essence is Zerto. There's not a lot of complexity to it, deliberately slow, and hopefully you've seen where this could be useful for some of your opportunities or some of your own use cases. Cool. Is there any questions on any of that?
It was all very clear and lots of interaction as we were going through. So
cool.
Thank you so much, Steve.
No worries. No problem at all.